Great morning, great morning. I am L. Angela Webb, the Chief of Police and Executive Director of Risk Management at Southwest Tennessee Community College in Memphis, Tennessee. I am also the Vice President of Finance for IACLEA. On behalf of our President, John Oshakova, I'd like to welcome you to our Global Campus Safety Series, Campus Response to Sexual Assault. IACLEA is truly the leading authority on campus safety, so we developed this series of trainings with you, our members and guests in mind. As we move into today's training, I'd like to introduce our moderator, who is the Chief of Police and Associate Vice President of Emergency Management at Clark Atlanta University. She has over 39 years of committed law enforcement experience. She started her career with the City of Atlanta Police Department in 1983 before retiring as a major in 2011. After retiring from the City of Atlanta Police Department, she served as a senior police advisor and deputy team leader responsible for providing law enforcement instructions, mentoring, and the delivery of training programs with the Narcotics Affairs section in Mexico. She received an exclusive and ethical leadership certificate from the Leadership Summit in the University of South Florida. She is a 2006 graduate of the Police Executive Research Forum, Senior Management Institute for Police. She participated in the Anti-Defamation League, where she visited Israel and received training on intervention strategies for domestic and gender-based violence in San Salvador. Please welcome, with a hearty round of applause, our moderator, Chief Deborah Williams.
Good morning. Thank you, VP Webb. Good morning, everyone. Hello, and welcome to IACLEA's Global Campus Safety Webinar Series. Today is the third and final webinar of the spring semester of a multi-part series where we have examined topics of importance to the global community. Today, we will be discussing sexual assault, which is a hot topic, and how we can not only improve our response to this serious crime, but also help to prevent it from occurring. As she said, I am Chief Deborah Williams from Clark Atlanta University, as well as a member of the IACLEA Board of Directors. And I'd like to welcome you to this important webinar today. First, we will be joined shortly by our panel of experts. But first, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Taking care of ourselves is more important than ever, and I encourage you to routinely check in with yourself and others as well. Only when we acknowledge that we ourselves sometimes need help can we truly help others. And I know that's why we're all here today. And thank you for being here. To participate in today's panel, we ask that you use the Q&A and/or chat function below to ask a question at any time during the presentation. We will save time at the end to ask our panelists as many of your questions as we can in the time we have together. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted in IACLEA's members-only community connections, as well as in other IACLEA's communications streams. And now, let's meet our expert panelists. We will give each panelist a moment to introduce themselves. First, we have Dr. Jill Dunlap. She's the Director for Research Policy and Civic Engagement with NASPA. We have Mark Fernandez with UN Women, Graham Golden, the Chief Inspector, Retired Police with Scotland. And again, thank you all for being with us. And now we'll jump right into, so we'll have our panelists to introduce each of themselves. We'll start with Dr. Dunlap.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. As was noted, I am the Senior Director for Research Policy and Civic Engagement at NASPA, which is a higher education association for student affairs professionals. So a lot of the folks who engage with sexual assault support services on college campuses. And I've been at NASPA for about 7 years, but prior to that worked at 3 different campuses, always in the role of supporting survivors of sexual assault. So I've been involved in that, shepherding students through investigations on college campuses. And at each of those campuses had an Office on Violence Against Women grant that helped us do that work. So just really excited to learn from all of the panelists here today and to be with you.
Now we will hear from Mr. Marco Fernandez.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Williams. So I'm Mirko Fernandez. I'm a part-time consultant for UN Women, and I help drive their gender-responsive policing line as part of the UN Global Program on Essential Services. I also consult with other international organizations on preventing and responding to gender-based violence. And occasionally, I conduct investigations into sexual and gender-based misconduct in the workplace. This is in some areas, it's known as the prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Golden.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Graham Goulden, and I'm a retired police officer from Scotland. I spent 30 years in policing. On my last 9 years of policing, I was a chief inspector working with our violence reduction unit. And it was in those last years that I really became passionate about, the prevention of sexual violence, gender-based violence. And I retired from policing in 2017. And now I am a violence prevention advocate, a trainer, leadership trainer and consultant, looking at bystander approaches in college campus, in workplaces. I'm also a national trainer with the Active Bystander for Law Enforcement, the ABLE program, which is very much up and running within the United States. So really, my focus is on prevention, but helping organizations to address these issues as well. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So now, thank you all for being with us today. And now we'll jump right into the conversation with the questions. First thing we want to talk about prevention. I know you all can take on that conversation. But we'll start with VP Webb. I want to ask you this question. Police and public safety have not always been a significant part of the conversation of prevention efforts. Why is it important for police and public safety to participate in preventing sexual assault, and how can we be more involved in these efforts?
Good morning. Thank you for that
Good morning.
question. It caught me off guard being the first one.
I know. That's why I love these.
Okay, so why is the police presence important? I think in general, the police presence is important because without students, we do not exist. Without students, there is no college. If the parents of our students do not trust us to keep their children safe, again, there will be no students, and therefore no need for us to have universities and to have colleges and institutes that provide higher learning. So it's critically important for us to not just be on campus, but to be visible on campus. We need to be seen because our presence is a deterrent in itself. And so our officers, it's good to just for the people to know we have them, but it's critically important for them to be seen walking, for them to be seen engaging our students, to be seen engaging our employees, because that is what's going to deter a sexual assault and any other crime.
Great. Thank you. Good response. Mr. Golden, we're going to give you that same question about prevention. Tell us why it's important for us to make sure that not only, as VP Webb stated, that we're visible, that we realize that our students are our purpose when it comes to safety on our campuses. So what would be your response, sir?
Before all you came on, I asked Angela Webb, are you busy? And police officers on campus are really, really busy. And one thing I've learned in policing is that we are very good at responding to calls. We're very good at detecting offenders, prosecuting offenders, but that's like playing whack-a-mole, isn't it? That's just like playing that game whack-a-mole. And we can play whack-a-mole all day, right? But we need to reduce the moles. And that's a good thing for policing. It's a good thing for victims because we have less victims and less perpetrators, less harm doers. But it starts to reduce the demand on our organization as well. And I think that's really important. I don't know what it's like in the US, but I know in the UK, policing is really being reduced. So many demands in different places. And I think if we get better at prevention of these issues, then there'll be benefits, cost benefits, but I think emotional, social benefits for you as police officers. So I think it's very important that we lean into these issues, because when we do that, we build trust and confidence as well with our students, with the parents. As a parent of 2 adult daughters who went through university, I know what it's like to have a daughter who's experienced some form of gender-based violence. So I think it does build trust and confidence. So for me, it's really important that we are curious about prevention. Policing, law enforcement isn't just about catching the baddies, the bad people. It's about preventing harm to your students and harm to our communities. So prevention is so important.
Great, thank you. And as I said earlier, when you talk about prevention, not only is it good to hear from our experts when it comes to law enforcement, but I would like to hear from Jill as well. And also I want to hear from, we want to hear from you, Marco, about prevention when it comes to sexual assault, because now we get to hear it from a different perspective other than law enforcement perspective. Go ahead, Jill, we'll hear from you.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, one of the things that was a big miss when I was working on college campuses was involving law enforcement in sort of regularly structured meetings, right? Like we have lots of meetings on campuses, and I'm not suggesting that everyone here wants to attend another meeting, but we have these like sort of case management meetings or behavioral threat assessment meetings, right? And I think sometimes we don't have all the right people at the table. And so I will just say, as someone who managed an office that was responsible for survivor support, but also prevention programming, that law enforcement was a really essential partner because, the officers were out on campus and could see areas that were hotspots for where these things were happening, or they could also identify behaviors that co-occur with sexual assault, right? Like they're like, yeah, we see a lot of alcohol use over here, or, in this section of the fraternity row or whatever, not to stereotype, but I think when we don't have those conversations about like, hey, where are you all feeling like things are not, on the up and up on campus, and then incorporating that into the prevention programming that happens, or even directing, additional law enforcement presence, that I think we miss a really good opportunity. And so when I was working on campus, like law enforcement, we were talking every single day about how I could do my job better, in terms of where I was directing my prevention programming, but then also, thinking through like, how do we provide better response? So I think they go hand in hand. And I think that campuses don't necessarily always think about law enforcement officers as being at that table when we're talking about prevention. And so when we start to break down those walls, I think we do a better job of it.
Great. Thank you, Gia. Marco, let us hear from you when it comes to prevention.
Thank you, Chief Williams. I think I'm going to complement what the other panelists have said, because I think it's really important hearing from them. I believe that police and public safety officers have an in-depth understanding of aggressor patterns and behaviors that are needed to inform prevention efforts. Specialized officers in particular understand firsthand how power imbalances are applied in practice, physically, psychologically, and sexually when exploiting an individual or a group's vulnerabilities. And being able to count on this input is critical to identifying and responding in a coordinated manner to addressing the root causes of sexual assault behavior. So pretty much added to what Jill and Graham had just said.
Great, thank you, sir, thank you. And as we heard from all of our experts, our panelists, when you talk about prevention, it's not just from a law enforcement perspective on what we can do in order to prevent sexual assault on our campuses. And as you heard, meetings, not only involving, but having the right people at the table when we have these meetings. And also, looking at the root causes. So as we heard about prevention, now we're gonna move on to what are some of the promises prevention strategies out there? So again, I know on every campus, because every time we talk about the best practices, and it depends on who you're speaking to, you're going to hear different things. But when you think about it, guess what? It all boils down to the same thing. What can we do to prevent these? Not only on our campuses, because some of our campuses are in areas that, like, for instance, a lot of our HBCUs are in areas that we know that crime rates is a little higher. So we look at prevention a little different. But the bottom line, when it comes to this, what can we all do? Because we all play a part when it comes to prevention. So we're going to reverse it. So instead of starting with our law enforcement experts, guess who I'm going to start with? You, Gia. So what are some of the promising prevention strategies out there coming from you that we can do as in the law enforcement community, not only in the law enforcement community, but with everyone that's on this webinar? What are some of the strategies that you think we can do in order to prevent sexual assault on and around our campuses?
I think for me, and I think I'm biased because I grew up professionally in student affairs, but I think it's, you know, engaging students where they're at and where their level of knowledge is, right? And that looks really different, I think, depending on where students are coming to us from. But it's almost, you know, we have this conversation in prevention circles a lot around like, okay, so we don't talk about healthy relationships or what consent looks like in high school. And then we suddenly like give students all this freedom and, you know, introduce alcohol into the equation. And then we're like, why aren't they, you know, behaving the way we want? Well, we haven't taught them the skills to do that. And so I think making sure that law enforcement is a part of that conversation. But again, from a partnership perspective, not a, if you do this, then we are going to come in and, you know, you're going to have to, you know, see us, but more of a, hey, we all are invested in you all having healthy relationships, being able to set boundaries. And so I think it's a lot of skill building. And the other thing that I will say is that, you know, this is something that I'm sure everyone here knows, but is dosage, right? I think a lot of campuses get caught up in the sort of requirement compliance mindset. And it's like, yeah, we give all of our first years this really great online module, right? And then again, we send them out into the world and onto campus and we're like, here, have, you know, add some alcohol, add some, you know, questionable, you know, partying behaviors. And then we expect that things are, you know, not going to go sideways. And so I think it's about repeating those prevention messages throughout the time, a student's time on our campus. Also, you know, not assuming that everybody comes in with understanding of what that looks like. And then I also think really understanding the different dynamics that exist within the sort of pockets of our campus and adjusting our prevention efforts to those, right? Like you have students who, and we'll talk about, I think, barriers to reporting later, but I think students aren't necessarily, they have different levels of expectations when they're in those groups, right? Like there's different cultural and behavioral norms based on where you are positioned within a campus. And so I think a one size fits all is not going to work. And so really, I think tailoring prevention messages and understanding students and honestly involving students in the development of prevention programs is a really good start. Like you cannot come in and just, like I said, put an online module in and expect that that's going to work for all students. So I think the promising practices are to do things in collaboration, especially with law enforcement, but also getting that student voice piece involved in whatever your prevention programming is, so that it speaks to the students at your specific institution.
Great, thanks, Jill. And as you said about inclusiveness, our students take on an ownership when we include them in the process. So that is an excellent point. All right, retired Chief Inspector from Scotland, what are some of the strategies that we can utilize? Can you unmute for me, please, sir?
I was the first one to make that mistake today. I apologize for that.
No problem.
You know, for me, my passion is bystander engagement. You know, we know the CDC in America in the 1980s highlighted that in upwards of 80% of or 75% of violent incidents, third parties are present in the build-up to situations, during situations, and the aftermath. And we need to start thinking about not only helping people intervene when they see things taking place, but to intervene, you know, in the bar, in the back of the car, in the locker room, when they start to hear friends using inappropriate language. And let's face it, a lot of what we're talking about is men's violence. I put a link in a chat to a campaign that's just been released. I consulted with Futures Without Violence to develop That Guy campaign, which came from Scotland. You know, we developed That Guy Scotland in 2021 after a high-profile homicide over here. And what we wanted to do with that campaign was to help men in particular, but everybody, make the connection between language and words and homicide and rape and sexual assault. So really helping, it's that idea of sweating the small stuff. So really, you know, for me is encouraging conversations with all students, but have a focus and take it. And I like what Jill said, going to where the students are. You know, in the sports teams. You know, I've helped develop Coaching Boys to Men, a program in campuses in the US. So I think that campaign there has got a whole curriculum that is being built around it. So start to do that and find the leaders within the universities as well. I think policing, go into sports teams, clubs, societies, and link in with these organizations and give them that sense of responsibility. A big motivator for bystanders is when you give people responsibility. So for me, it's about instilling that sense of responsibility. Friends don't let friends drive drunk was your campaign in the 1980s. Let's use that on this idea as well. So bystander conversations, engaging our boys and men, and last one for me, social norms approaches. You know, the social norms research expert, Dr. Alan Berkowitz, taught me so much about the need to promote the healthy, within campuses. When you start to promote the healthy norms, people will automatically follow that. So start to build conversations, build communities of trust, safety, and respect, but talk about the positives that's going on in your campus, as well as the negatives. Balance it out, but don't just focus on the negatives, because that can actually make the problem worse if we just focus on the bad stuff. So there's lots there, but check out future stuff. I'm dead proud that we've managed to take the kilt off that guy and bring it to America. So there you go, something for you to use.
Great, thank you. And thank you for introducing Future Without Violence, that guy. And some of the things that we talk about all the time, I mean, and you hearing them in the conversation, accountability, holding each other accountable for their actions. And we always talk about having accountability partners. And there's nothing wrong with introducing that to our students. And, responsible, the social norms, building trust. So again, all of those are some of excellent, being inclusive, some excellent points when it comes to some of the strategies of what we can do to prevent. So now that we talked about prevention, so now we're going to talk about preparation. Next, let's look at preparing our departments for responding to sexual assault. So I see you smiling, VP Webb, because I'm coming to you on this question. What are some ways that we can prepare our agencies to effectively respond to sexual assault reports? Because we know that students sometimes feel as though that we're just report takers and we're not doing anything else. So I encourage you, when you talk about this, when you respond to this question, again, we want to not talk more so about taking the reports, but effectively responding to the sexual assault reports within our agencies. What are some of the ways we can prepare our agencies to do that?
All right, thank you. So I'm definitely going to say our officers need training because often our approach can be extremely skewed and we can have the way we approach a sexual assault complaint could make the difference between a successful prosecution or a student feeling like there's no one that they can talk to and they would never bring a situation up like this again. So I definitely say we need to start with training, but not just training amongst ourselves. With my department, we train with student services because I want the officers to role play the situation. So we have practical exercises. So they can see the viewpoint of how it feels to be on the other side of the seat. So we're not just report takers. We have to be good listeners. We also, at some points, we might have to step into a counseling role, even though that isn't what the intended goal is to be. Sometimes we just might need to be a listening ear or a shield almost for the person that's been victimized to lean on. But the best way to be able to be those things and wear those different hats is to be trained on how to do that and to be trained outside of our law enforcement comfort zone, because we don't want to give anyone the impression they're not believed or that we're re-victimizing them because of any bias opinion we may have going into the complaint. So I'm definitely going to say, start with training and then expand that training so that it's not just police being trained. We're also being trained with our students, or we're also being trained with our employees. So the training is more interactive, more realistic, more engaging. So when we actually have that situation, the empathy in us and the sympathy in us can come forefront and allow us to treat the victim as a true victim.
Great, thank you. And as you said about training, doing the role play, and that's an excellent idea because you're placing the students, you're placing the officers in the shoes of a victim. And also one thing you mentioned about the different hats. And so we all have to realize that when it comes to law enforcement, you're the mentor, you're the coach, you're the teacher, you're the counselor, you're the parent, you're all of those things. And you need to remember when handling those reports that you have to make sure that you're able to switch off that law enforcement hat so you don't re-victimize your victim. So again, great, excellent point. So Mirko, so I want to send you this question here. Do you talk a little bit about the importance of partnerships in preparing for reports of sexual assaults, such as our SARS working with advocates? How can that help us with preparation in our agencies in responding to these incidents?
Yeah, thank you, Chief Williams. Partnerships are only really impactful when they actually increase the meaningful participation of victims and survivors in the response process. Primarily access to essential services that are informed, consented, and prioritize safety and well-being. That's, I think, that the first response is crucial, because especially if it's done in partnership, because as it will dictate how decisive the whole coordination will be. So I think without proper and well-coordinated interagency coordination, in order to make sure that the victim survivors' essential needs are being addressed, then I have a hard time seeing that collaboration that's needed for a successful intervention. So I think it's important to make sure that the response is coordinated, that is well informed, but also takes in inputs. And I really like what Jill and Graham were saying, making sure that inputs also come in terms of partnerships from outside sources that include student bodies, so that people understand what is at stake there and what are the needs. So coordination that is informed, and that's consented and prioritizes safety and well-being. That's what I would say for that question.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted, I see where Chief Inspector Golden commented that you want to build empathy, victims experience, leaders, set and mood music on this topic is also a key. They say if you feel strongly about it, shout it out. So thank you, Chief Inspector, for that. You'd like to respond on that, Chief Inspector?
It was just that question about preparing our officers that Angela talked about. I think empathy is a big driver for bystanders, and let's face it, police officers are bystanders when they respond to an incident, and it's what they do with what they notice. And I think if we start to put officers in the shoes of victims and survivors, that can only be a good thing. And I think as leaders, you set mood music, you set the tone on how your organizations are going to respond to this. If you feel strongly about this, talk about it. Leaders create leaders. And I think it's so important that we start to hear that from the top, but down as well, and back up again. That's all I wanted to say there.
Great, thank you, sir. Dr. Dunlap, the next question is for you. Why are people hesitant to report sexual assault, and why is it important to understand when preparing for officers taking reports?
Oh gosh, I mean,
I know this is a topic we could talk about forever.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it, I would say one of the things that I regularly heard from students is the fear of the impact in their communities that it would have if they reported, right? And so sometimes students just don't want to report, right? Like they're like, look, I know what happened was wrong. I don't want there to be serious consequences. I heard that a lot. So I think we also have to understand that, like, while our goal as institutions and as law enforcement may be to get the report, that we just have to understand that sometimes students aren't going to get there, or they may not get there right now, but they may need some time to digest and then get to that point where they're ready to report. But I think about like all the cases I worked where, students were like, if I report this, my sorority is not going to be able to have a social with this fraternity. And I thought, like, this could not be your priority, right? But it was. And they were like, this is my whole world here. And so if I do this, I am tearing apart my social network, and I'm just not going to do that to my sorority sisters, right? And I heard that on multiple occasions. I think, the thought of being sort of excommunicated from a club in which you're really invested, if you make that report against someone else who, may have caused you harm in that social circle. So I think the insular nature of campuses and where students sort of find their home within the institution among their peers is a huge reason why we see students not reporting. This goes back a little bit to the previous question as well, but I will also say, and I know I'm biased because I've been in an advocate role almost, a chunk of my career, but I think those advocates smooth the way for officers to get information that they want. And I think in particular about a case where the officer, who was investigating asked the student to see her cell phone, and she said, absolutely not. And he was like, well, this video that you think that someone took, or these pictures that you took are on there. And so when the officer left, the student said to me, I have pictures on this phone of me using not legal drugs, and I don't want that to be used against me, right? So I think also the fear of being held accountable for other behavior that might have been happening is a barrier. And some campuses have really good policies on amnesty, right? Where like, if you report a sexual assault, even if you were underage drinking, you're not going to be held accountable for that under the student code of conduct. But I do think those fears play into why students don't come forward, and that they will sometimes not say things to law enforcement that they will say to their advocate, and then their advocate can make things happen behind the scenes, right? About like, let's get the officer what they're asking you for, so that we can pursue this case if you're interested in reporting. But I think lowering those, or like not getting rid of those fears, but talking through those fears with students, which I think law enforcement can do a really good job of, is one way to help them get to a place where they might be willing to report without coercing them, right? But like, I think understanding the underlying fears that are between here's what happened to me and getting to a report, I think is a really important step. And I think that can be done in lockstep with an advocate often.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, as we said earlier, we can talk about this topic, and I know others have their questions. So what we'll do, we're going to end the panelists probably within, we'll give it 8 more minutes, and then we'll allow some of the attendees to ask questions. But one thing I want to point out, one of the attendees made an excellent point, that sometimes we have to think about victim blaming and the rape culture. It's a huge issue on our campuses. So not wanting the perpetrator to get into trouble is also a huge component. So we have to think about all of those things. So next question, I'm going to open it up to our panelists. What are some other issues we should be considering and preparing our agencies for response? And I'm gonna go with you, Gia, since you're an advocate, because some of the points that you made earlier, I mean, this is where, when we utilize those advocates, when we think outside of the box, this is a area that we all can use some assistance in. So what are some of the issues we should be considering preparing our agencies for response, Gia?
I feel like I've talked too much. So I just want to say really briefly that I think campus law enforcement does an incredible job of this. And I will just say by way of experience that at my most recent institution, we had students who primarily all lived on campus first semester, and then they all moved to the same spot, literally across the street from campus after that first semester. And that's where the majority of our assaults were happening. And that was not necessarily under the jurisdiction of the campus police. And I would have students come to me and say, I had a really bad experience with the city police. I want campus law enforcement to, investigate this. And I felt really bad because I was like, I can't, that's not something I have within my power to do, right? But it was because our campus law enforcement were so well trained. And I think just we're so responsive to the students and empathetic to the students that they recognize them as being the go-to, I will be made to feel good about this process if I'm working with campus law enforcement. So I just want to kudos to everybody on the call, because I do think by virtue of the fact that some of this training is required by Title IX and that kind of thing, but and Clery, but I think campus law enforcement does a great job of this. One of the quick things I'll say that we did at my most recent institution was also funding a specific, and we got grant funding for it, but we funded a specific officer whose sort of sole duty was they were the go-to around sexual assault. And so they were really well trained in how to take reports and, pass on for investigations and all of that. But also I will say that person served as a resource to other officers in cases where I, as the student services person, right, the advocate who's clearly biased and thinks everyone, was sexually assaulted, which I've heard before, but that, officers were really ready to go to this one identified officer and ask questions and not be made to feel like they were going to say something victim blaming or whatever, right? So I think to the extent that you can have officers that serve as that resource within an agency, I think that can be a really powerful tool.
Great, thank you. As you all heard, the different preparation of what we can do when it comes to reporting. So what we're going to do now, we're going to shift our gears a little here. As we talk about sexual assault, we want to shift the conversation to response and investigation. So as we said, we're going to open it up for our guests, for our attendees to ask questions. But the second, as you talked about, you mentioned Cleary. So because Cleary, and also when you talk about Title IX, and again, unfortunately, VP Webb, it's on you again. In the United States, there are some special considerations in responding to sexual assault on our campuses. Talk a little about Cleary and Title IX and how these just for the, excuse me, how these federal laws impact responses.
Okay, before I respond, Merkel has had his hand up twice.
Oh, Merkel, okay.
So
Merkel, I am
there
so,
may be
Merkel,
something
please
burning on
apologize.
his heart.
Oh, okay. So Merkel, we're
Thanks.
going to allow you an opportunity to respond on this before we go to that next question. Go ahead, Merkel.
Thank you, Chief Williams, and thank you. Yeah, I think Jill points out something interesting, and it get back to what Graham was also talking about, bystander. When Jill mentioned about the fact that the student didn't want to share information or collaborate because she was worried it was on the phone. And often this is the case where victims or potential victims may not feel they're believed. So it gets back to this kind of blame the victim culture. And a lot of this is down to harmful bias that we're still working to stamp out. And so there has to be an emphasis on transformational changes. And what I've seen as a trend that's actually, I believe, is tackling that are several things. And one of them is the bystander culture, which, we have Graham on board, which, he's absolutely the authority on this topic. And that's really important in terms of trying to motivate healthy masculinities. When we talk about the healthy parts, and healthy masculinities is really critical to responding and to preventing harmful bias. So this is where, the contributions and the added value of the bystander, particularly for men and boys in leadership positions, no matter what group they're in, whether in a student body or whether on a sports team, it's that leadership that's really important in standing up. And as Graham was saying, because at the end of the day, people feel like I don't have the power and I'm powerless against what I think is people are not going to believe me. And so I feel I'm going to be discredited because that is actually what tends to happen. That's what people hear. The other one, which I think is really important, is representation of women in law enforcement. I think that's really important. I think victims, which are disproportionately women and girls, tend to look towards a representation as legitimacy. If they see women in law enforcement, they feel, okay, they're representing me. I feel they're more legitimate. So they'll feel, hey, I want to cooperate. I want to tell my story. I want to share my experience of what happened. So that's really important. And that comes down to gender equality and equity, making sure that women in all their diversity are able to participate at all levels of policing. So I think that's also very transformational, is to make sure that gender equality and equity is embedded in any approaches when it comes to organizational transformations. And the 30 by 30, I think Josh, before, who was one of our hosts, he was mentioning how IACLEA is working towards having female recruits by at least 30% by year 2030. This is great. This is exactly important. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. This is exactly what needs to be done to move forward. And so, I just want to add that, and the importance of making sure that when moving forward, that we don't forget about the transformational aspects of responding and addressing to harmful bias, because at the end of the day, that's really what's limiting the expertise of police, that's limiting the investigations, added value, and that's limiting all the social services that come together to try to support the victim and try to bring some kind of justice to the process. Anyway, so that's my 2 cents there. So
no, that's a lot. No, we
you.
appreciate it. No, because you talk about the bystanders and you talk about the comfortability, and we all know, and this is an opportunity, you mentioned the 30 by 30 pledge, and I hopefully that all of our panelists are, part of the 30 by 30 pledge. And again, it's about making sure the victim feel comfortable. And a lot of the victims, when it comes to reporting sexual assault, almost, they feel comfortable when someone is sitting in front of them that looks just like them. So again, we appreciate that comment. Thank you. So now, VP Webb. So now Gia brought up the conversation about the Cleary Act. So we want to talk a little bit about in the U.S. there are some special considerations when it comes to responding to sexual assault. Can you talk a little bit about the Cleary and the Title IX and how these federal laws can impact our response if we respond and if we don't respond appropriately, if you don't mind?
All right, so that question requires a huge answer. I don't know if we have a lot of time.
Oh no, just briefly.
But the the way that the Clery and Title IX governs our institutions, students here in Tennessee, a victim does not have to report a sexual assault to campus police. It is not required. So they can go to Title IX, or they can go to an instructor, one of our, someone else on campus, not necessarily the police. We can't require that, but we do try to encourage it because we want to be sure that we are in compliance. We are in compliance with the federal law that governs how we respond and what our response looks like. And so as it relates to Clery, we're addressing all sorts of crimes, not just sexual assaults. We're addressing all sorts of crimes, and we're reporting that so that we can keep track of what's happening. And we can look at trend analysis, and we can look at ways to deter all of the crimes that we are required to report. But as it relates to sexual assaults, it's a very touchy situation, because even though the victim is not required to report, when they do report, there are so many additional steps that we need to take. And really, we need to not take those steps as police. We need to almost take those steps as friend, holding the hand of the victim, walking them through the entire reporting process, not just filing a report with police. We need to be sure that they have an advocate. We need to be sure that they are offered counseling services. We need to be sure that if they need someone to go to court with them, that they have someone they're comfortable with to also go to court with them. So we should be not just the reporting body, but we also should be the facilitator of the additional support and resources that the victim needs. And so Clery kind of encompasses that. Title IX encompasses the reporting to the campus, and how we address the victim, how we address the offender, and how we manage having both of them on campus. If we end up with both of them on campus, what does that look like? And how do we continue to, not now just protecting the victim, we also have to protect the offender.
Thank you, VP Webb. So the next question, I'm going to allow each panelist, Dr. Dunlap and Chief Inspector Golden and Merkel, I'm going to allow each one of you to answer this last question because we want to hear from all three of you all. What are the lasting impacts of sexual assault, not just for the individual victim, but for communities as well? Dr. Dunlap, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it goes back a little bit to what I was saying about the insular nature of like the sort of pockets of different communities within a campus. And so, I mean, you think about on an athletic team, if both people, the harmed party and the person causing harm are both on that sports team, like what does that mean for the rest of the team or the rest of the club or the rest of the Greek organization? And so I do think we sometimes lose the forest for the trees, right? Like we're so intent on serving that survivor that we don't sort of understand what the message is that is sent to the rest of the community. And I think that's a key part of prevention, right? Like that this will be handled, it will be taken seriously, you will be believed, which is, I think, a deterrent to future assaults. And so not that the survivor themselves is not important, but I do think it's important to have those conversations with the community after these types of things are reported. So, and the lasting, impact, I think you mentioned earlier, and that was that, like in that very instance, when you take that report, whether or not that person is believed is absolutely, there's so much research on the fact that like PTSD is lowered if they're believed by friends or whoever they first tell that they were assaulted. And so it just cannot be emphasized enough that initial the initial instance in which that person comes forward who has been harmed, that they are treated with respect and believed, because it absolutely paves the path for toward healing if they are treated with respect.
Great, thank you. Merkel, we'll move to you, and then Chief Inspector Golden, you'll finish us off with that question. Merkel?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it impacts how communities view how justice is served. And legitimate the essential services are. And what's critical to operational success for police is the trust they have in the communities, because it's how police prevent and respond to crimes, is that they have coordination, collaboration with the communities. Communities want to speak to them and say, look, I'm not feeling secure because this, and this, or this has happened to me. I'm trusting you to help me to deal with this issue. If that trust is not there for reasons that they believe that the services are not adequate, are not responsive, are not taking into account their needs, then it's going to lose that trust, and that's going to impact and have a greater, it's going to facilitate crime, in my opinion, crime and violence. So it's really important that at the end of the day that how the interventions towards sexual assaults are viewed is linked to how much trust they believe they can build with their communities. So they go together, so they feed into each other. So yeah, that's my part there.
Great, thank you, Rico. Chief Inspector Golden.
Thank you. Everything Jill said and Marco said, and just to add, sexual assault. Anybody can be a victim of sexual assault. We know that men, women, non-binary people, anybody can be a victim. But let's face it. The vast majority of our victims, yes, that are reported, we get that, are female victims, male perpetrators. And last year I was on television in the UK, and there was a lady who was being interviewed. A member of the public was being interviewed before me, and she said something which really struck with me. She said, "I'm scared of men." Okay, so, and I was brought on to answer a question, and I said, hey, before I answer your question, let's go back to what that young lady said there. She's scared of half of the population. Now, us guys, the men listening to this, we are being defined by the worst behaviors that we're willing to accept. And so I think sexual assault, a lack of response to sexual assault in general, is defining us guys as potential harm doers. And I know, and people in this call know, that the vast majority of men don't commit sexual violence, sexual assault, whatever. But a lot of us have been silent in the build-up to situations. So I think, just to try and take it away from just that obvious example, impact on victims, I think our gender is being defined negatively by our lack of response. And hopefully that might motivate people to be more active around these issues, because I meet a lot of young men who are afraid to, for example, stop and help a young lady who might be needing help on the street or on university campus. Why is that? Because what if I'm accused of sexual harassment? So that's a real fear that I think is being created by a lack of leadership. And I said before, we've been seeing leadership from women and girls on this topic for decades. We need more leadership from men on this topic. So that's just something offside to sort of bring into the conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for answering that last question. So now we're going to shift gears again. So now we're going to give our panelists our participants an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question, please make sure you place your question in Q&A, because we want to try to get to as many of those questions as we can within the next couple of minutes before we close out, before we wrap up. So one of the questions that someone asked, they said they have a big alcohol culture. So how do you address high-risk behavior without victim blaming? Taker, as our advocate. Jill, you want to take that? Everyone's looking like, I think I take that one. Jill, you want to take that? Okay.
I think you can have really adult conversations with students, right? About saying, like, no one is responsible for causing harm. No one is responsible for experiencing harm, right? It's at the responsibility of the person who causes harm, but like, alcohol is very much used as a weapon often on college campuses to get people to lower their inhibitions. And so I think you can talk to students about, like, these are calculated decisions that you will be making if you are, using alcohol in one sitting versus another, right? So again, it's like, you wouldn't say to students like, oh, you're putting yourself at risk if you're, at home with a friend or whatever. But if you don't understand the fact that, most of those assaults are happening between people who know each other, like, I think we're still battling this notion of stranger danger when we talk about sexual assault on college campuses. And so I think we need to talk to students about, like, it's fine to drink, but also understand that, like, even if you have a set series of boundaries, like, when alcohol fuzzes your brain, those boundaries get a little bit harder to, I think, articulate to others, but also you forget what they are. And so, like, I just think it's it's a hard conversation because you don't want to tell students not to drink because then their brain shuts down and they're like, I stopped listening to you. But I think you can say to students, like, you're taking this risk when you engage in alcohol, and it doesn't make you responsible for anything that happens to you, but just know that these two things go hand in hand. And so know what you are taking on when you include alcohol in any given situation. And it's, again, not predetermined that alcohol is going to lead to sexual assault, but the data shows us, right, that those two things co-occur at astronomical rates. And so I think having those conversations with students without talking about abolition is really the key.
Right, great.
Can I-
Thank you.
Can I chime in here quickly?
Yes, sir.
I-
Marco, go ahead.
Just 2 points. I think it's important to stipulate that drinking alcohol is not a crime, sexual assault is. And that's really important, right? So to distinguish that. And also what I think is also equally important is making sure that the student bodies, or in this case, understand what consent is, and understanding about the importance of getting that consent. So investigation should focus more on how did you gain consent, as opposed to looking and victim blaming or placing the burden of proof on the victim. It should be more perpetrator focused, and how did you get consent for that act? And so that's just two points that I think are complementary to what Jill was saying.
Oh, no, that's a good point about consent. I mean, how do you gain consent? What does it look like? So good point, Mirko. And I see Chief Inspector Golden, I want to direct this question to you. Trauma-informed training for officers, faculty, and staff is important. Many times students go to a peer or staff faculty member. Poor responses can dictate whether they get help or even report to the police at all. Can you give us your response to that particular statement?
Yeah, my view is that we should be training everybody to respond to a sexual assault victim, not just professionals. Victims will go to a person they trust, right? A trust, that's a friend, that's an academic, that's a law enforcement officer, a parent, whoever. And the fact that they go to you, so let's say, for example, they choose you, they don't choose me, they don't choose anybody else, they choose you. They're paying you a compliment. So I keep it nice and simple. Thank you for coming to speak to me. That must have been difficult to talk about. What happened to you was wrong, and I believe what you're telling me, that wasn't your fault. What do you want to do? There's a simple template that we can train anybody in the world to use. It's still difficult, but we don't have to complicate this. As someone who does active bystander training, I train people to be able to respond to that friend. It's highly likely that in some stage in our life, a friend, a colleague, a family member will disclose something to you, especially if you talk about this stuff and you show interest in it. So just keep it to the point, validate people's experiences, believe victims, because we know the research says that a victim's telling the truth, and just remove the blame. What do you want to do? Victims of violence lose power. Your job is to give power back. And it doesn't have to be complicated. So I think anybody at a university campus, anybody can be trained to respond, that first responder when it comes to sexual violence. So yeah, I think trauma training is required everywhere.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question is, a number of education institutions have in the past launched behavior change programs. How effective have these behavior change programs been at reducing the incidence of sexual assaults on campuses? VP Webb, can you respond to that question for us, please? And some people, they call them different. Some might be an behavior assessment program. So different campuses have different names for these type of programs.
Okay, so thank you. My institution, we're called the BETA. It's the Behavior Intervention and Threat Assessment team. And actually we meet once a month. And what we do to try to provide guidance and additional leadership and prevention in our monthly meetings. And the team is comprised of almost every entity on campus: police, counseling, student development. We have someone from Title IX, someone from HR. We have our group is very well represented with people from all of the organizations that makes decisions, or the departments that make decisions on campus, or that conduct investigations on campus. So in our monthly meetings, we're looking at different student behaviors. We're looking at letters that or papers or notes that students write, and we're analyzing those to see if there's any potential for that particular student to cause harm, so that we can intervene before harm is actually caused. We also, it gives us an opportunity, something may be reported to my office that has not been reported to Title IX that really should go to Title IX. So it gives us an opportunity to have that discussion and collaborate on how we're going to move forward with a particular complaint. And so it may be Title IX takes it all over, or we work in conjunction with each other. But having that beta team, for me, it allows a better working relationship with all of the entities on campus. And I hear a lot of horror stories often that police and Title IX don't get along. They won't give us this, they won't tell us that. It's like a tug of war. And I'm really happy to say that that is not my experience, because we are meeting so often as a group. We have been able to build a better relationship. And so even when there's something goes to Title IX that is solely Title IX, our Title IX coordinator will come to me and say, hey, I just want you to know this is what's going on, just in case this student has come across your desk in another form or another avenue or something like that. So I definitely believe in and will advocate for and encourage, if your institution does not have something like a behavior intervention team or behavior enhancement team, be the initiator and the creator, because it is definitely a benefit, especially when you have on-campus housing. Loop the on-campus housing people into the committee so that you all can have constant discussions, not with just when things are going wrong, but you are able to see potential things that may go wrong.
Right. Thank you, VP Webb. But as you all can see, this is a hot topic and we can go on several hours. Unfortunately, we don't have several hours today. But before we end this, I'd like to give each panelist 30 seconds, if we can, as we wrap it up, to allow each panelist to share any closing thoughts they may have before we close this out. So we'll start with you, Marco.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just want to say, and I can only compliment what Graham and Jill and Chief Williams and Lieutenant Webb have been saying. It's essentially you want ownership of the issues for us to own it and not to ignore it. And here, really, men and boys, as Graham was saying, really we have to own the issues and to take it forward, and also to make sure that we stand up when we see injustice, whether it's sexual assaults against men, boys, women, or girls, that we stand up. And I think this is really important. So bystander culture, Graham, great that you're here.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it. Dr. Dunlap, you want to give us a response for 30 seconds, please?
I could just say the thing that I heard repeatedly throughout our time together today is the power of partnerships. And if you aren't at the table, I think there's no harm in inviting yourself to the table as law enforcement to say like, hey, we want to come to these case management meetings. We want to come to this meeting. We want to come to your prevention meeting. And I think that kind of outreach is going to be really welcomed, especially by the student affairs folks on your campus.
Great. Thank you. Chief Inspector Godin.
A lot of today we focused on students. And here's a challenge for all of you. Have the courage to look within your organization as well. You'll have victims and survivors of domestic abuse, sexual violence, so be aware of that, but also be aware of harm doers within your organization as well. And programs like ABLE and other bystander programs that have been designed for police officers, consider bringing them into your organization, because that will build trust and confidence amongst your organization, but also with students and campuses as well. So have the courage to look inside as well as outside. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I know one person wanted us to bring up about having meetings, our regular meetings with our Greek organization and our student leaders. Yes, we do recommend that. And so we're going to close it out. Again, thank you to our panelists. Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you. Again, this is such a hot topic and it's a never ending topic. So again, thank each of you all for being here. Josh.
Thank you, Chief Williams, and thank you to all our panelists, especially Chief Webb, who filled in at the last minute as a panelist. So we really appreciate your flexibility there. And we really do appreciate you being with us today. And thank you to all of you for participating. If you have questions for our panelists that you were not able to ask, please email me at jbronson@iaclea.org. We'll also compile a list of the questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to and try to get you some answers for those. I do hope that you found this webinar to be informative, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for future webinars and other IACLEA programs and trainings throughout the year, including our annual conference coming up June 27th through the 30th in Orlando, Florida. We have a great lineup of educational speakers, exhibitors, and networking opportunities for you, and we hope to see you there. Additional information and registration can be found at www.iaclea.org. Thank you again, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Stay safe.